What's up, guys? I'm fresh off of my last video where I compare the Petzl Connect and dual connect adjust. So if you haven't seen that yet, then go into my videos, check it out. It really helps out with the algorithm. But now, another thing that everyone loves to listen to apparently are one of my talking points. And this one's a doozy because there are tons of opinions out there. And in my mind, a lot of kind of misinterpretations around this specific thing. So I wanted to give my 2 cents and give a bit of the community's 2 cents on this, and also hopefully clarify a few things around this idea. Okay, so I'm going to try to be in-depth about this. I'm going to cover a couple different materials, starting with nylon, some Dyneema, and then I have an extra third thing that not as many people are familiar with. But let's talk about girth hitching through your belay point versus your tie-in points. As always with my videos, I'm going to start with an example of what I'm talking about so that way people can see, and then I'll move into the actual talking part. So let's go into crotch view. Okay, so it goes without saying, this is a harness, this is my belay loop, here are my 2 tie-in points. Now a little bit about construction on the harness, just so that we know for the future. The tie-in point is essentially the exact same as a belay loop, but it has extra material woven around it. And the reason why that is because we tie in ropes to these 2 points and we take big whippers and falls on them and stuff. And so having that extra material around the actual strong part of the harness helps with the rubbing of that fabric, or the soft goods on soft goods thing. And that's why I have a different video talking about a harness that I retired, but in that harness, which was my sport climbing harness, I actually had plastic showing right here because the rope rubbed through the protection fabric of my tie-in point, and that's when it's a good time to retire your harness. So that's really the difference between belay loop and tie-in points, is that extra fabric to reinforce the structural part of the harness. And so the idea with that is you could just put a bunch of fabric around a belay loop and then make that good for rubbing with soft goods, but it's obviously unnecessary because you have the 2 tie-in points. So the belay loop is just only structural material, and the reason why is because we clip metal things to it. So the metal things move around a whole lot. When they pull, they pull the 2 tie-in points together, but it's that freedom of moving around and the fact that it's metal. There's not as much friction with metal going through this, whereas the friction caused by rope rubbing through your 2 tie-in points is quite a bit more, which is why they had to reinforce these to make a harness last a good lifespan. So that's a little bit of structure right there. So what the consensus is, and this isn't necessarily a bad one, is if you're clipping metal to your harness, you clip it to the belay loop, metal to the belay loop, and if we're attaching any sort of soft good like rope or slings to our harness, we go in through the 2 tie-in points, like so. So is there a reason why we shouldn't do this? You know, theoretically, it's still sound and strong, and if you're an old school climber, I'm sure you still clip into your harness like this a whole lot. Of course, there are plenty of reasons not to belay like this setup on your harness at all. The big one being a triaxial loading on a carabiner, another one being that the carabiner can easily come unclipped, and it also adds a twist in your rope. Those are just a few reasons off the top of my head why you shouldn't do that. So I will pretty much always clip metal things into my harness like so. However, I am a bit more freeformed on girth hitching my sling to the 2 tie-in points versus girth hitching to the belay loop. And to give you another example, this is what I'm talking about, just passing it through and then up. The idea is that people will just say you only girth hitch soft goods through your tie-in points and only clip metal through the belay point. But why is this exactly bad? That's the main question. And how can we make this okay with our systems? So that's what the whole point of this video is about. Okay, so there's a little bit about harness build, and also a little bit about what the point of this video is, girth hitching through the belay loop versus the tie-in points. And so I'm going to start this off with, if you're new to climbing, you just learned how to do sport anchors like last week or whatever and clean them and all that, just go with whatever your instructor told you, because this is moving into more advanced, higher level decision making. It may seem trivial because it's just about this versus like putting your harness here versus there, but it is going into a bit more of an advanced topic for some people. This is higher level decision making, and it's kind of in the raw, but I also think that a lot of the decision making out there is based off of a bit of flawed logic, which is why I'm making this video. So a lot of people like to reference Todd Skinner and his death involving the belay loop breaking. And a lot of arguments I heard about that is from people assuming that just from girth hitching through the belay loop once, that made the belay loop break, which doesn't make any sense at all, because you take lead falls, you catch lead falls on your belay loop. Literally, even a small lead fall is like 1.5 to 3 times your body weight just from falling through the air before your buddy catches you. And people do these monster whippers, and they get caught with their belay loop. So if you girth hitch a piece of fabric through your belay loop, it's not going to break it. So we know that, like, let's throw that one out there. So the idea was that they were saying that if you girth hitch through the belay loop, then it's going to saw into it and then break apart, which is more or less true, but it has to be over a large span of time. So Todd Skinner had what I believe was a daisy chain girth hitched around his belay loop. Again, we also know daisy chains you're not supposed to use as personal anchors, they're for aid climbing. But he had that daisy chain girth hitched through his belay loop throughout the entire lifespan of his harness. And that also brings into the question of how long was he using that harness, right? If we know old school climbers and we know Yosemite locals, he probably had that harness for about 10 years, or maybe a few years less or more, but he probably had it longer than he should have been. If you're using your harness like 4 times a week, every week for, like that same exact harness, it's probably going to be done after like 2 years. The harnesses do not last that long if you use them 4 times a week or so, which is about probably what he was doing. And that's just the way it is, like I have to replace my harnesses every 2 to 3 years, depending on their use. And luckily I switch around between a bunch of different harnesses, so that helps spread the wear out and they last a bit longer, but it's just something that happens. So if you use the same exact harness every day for 4 times a week average, working in Yosemite where it's really hard on gear, and you keep the same material girth hitched to the same part of the belay loop, you can't see what's happening in that belay loop. And that's where the most amount of wear is going to happen, is where the material is squeezing that belay loop. So naturally, it was only a matter of time, really. And that's a sad thing to really, die from, but that is the parameters of what we're talking about here. So if you have a 30-year-old harness or a 20-year-old harness or a 6-year-old harness and you climb a lot, you might want to replace that. I mean, it's not that much money when you think about the hospital bill or the funeral bill for not just replacing your gear, especially something like a harness. They're only like $60 if you don't want one with all the fancy gadgets and stuff. So that is ultimately the parameters around that one single incident that people keep on referring to as the end-all be-all to the argument. So now that we've disproven that, how can we avoid that exact situation? And the easy way is the same techniques that was probably taught to you in whatever course you took. The idea of taking that personal anchor off of your harness when you're done using it. So if I am on a alpine climb or whatever I do, and then we climb to the top, I use the rope, clove hitching myself to the top all the way, and then now we're rappelling down. I will pull out whatever material I use. It could be a connect adjust, it could be double length sling of varying different materials that they make, and then I will attach it to my harness, use it for however many rappels we have to do, 10, 15, whatever. When I get to the bottom, I take it off of my harness. and that allows the belay loop to rotate and it doesn't receive wear all in one spot. And that's the same deal for your tie-in points too, you know? If you just keep a personal anchor attached to your tie-in points throughout the entire lifespan of the harness, you don't know what's happening under there. So it's not like that holds any water either. You have to take these personal anchors off of your harness when you're done using them. You cannot just simply leave them on your harness forever. So is it really a bad thing to girth hitch through the belay loop versus the tie-in points? No, not really, as long as you take that stuff off. So that's kind of like the full-on blanket right there. Different materials I like to use as my girth hitch. One is that nylon sling that you saw, which I mainly use in the rock world. In the alpine world, you'll see me using more of this sort of stuff. Dyneema is a bit of a hot topic among the guiding community with girth hitching this stuff, and you know, kind of girth hitching this thin little stuff around my belay loop. I'm a little more hesitant of, and I know some guides that recommend not to do that at all. They don't care about other materials. They're fine with nylon through the belay loop, but they don't recommend Dyneema just because it's so thin. You know, it just focuses in all the weight on one point. One thing that I think is okay is a basket hitch through the belay loop, which I'll show you right now. So this is something that's good to use with longer slings like a triple or a quad length, but you can pass this through right here, meet both ends, and then tie a knot somewhere in between, just like that. So that gives a bit more room, a bit less rub, and then it still gives you plenty of extension for your belay device and then whatever you want to clip that to. Yeah, generally when I'm using Dyneema, I will basket hitch it through my belay loop if need be. And if I am going to use Dyneema in a girth hitch situation, I tend to go through the two tie-in points. Just that thinner stuff, you know, it just rubs a bit harder. So this just helps increase the lifespan of my harness. Not that I'd ever have an extension this long. If I was using a triple length or longer, then I would probably just go for the basket hitch because I don't need to be able to reach so far out. Another material that blends the gap between the two is this stuff. This is made by Idelrid, and it's made out of aramid fiber. So it's a bit of a different material. It's still pretty strong. That's because this is so thin, and this sling is 22 kilonewtons, but you can see that it's rounded. So the rounded stuff I don't mind as much putting around here because you can see it doesn't just bite down so hard. So I'm not really worried about that causing extra wear on my belay loop. And then I can tie whatever anchor I want. Or actually, since I use this in the alpine, I generally go for length, which is another great part about the belay loop, is it gives you a little extra length. And I just do this overhand, and I have a full anchor that I can clip to anything and have a lot of room to move around, generally on those bigger ledges that you get in the alpine world. So there you go. I mean, that's pretty much all I want to say on the matter right now, along with the different materials that I use and kind of my preference. But in the end, it doesn't really matter what material you use and where you girth hitch it on your harness. There are plenty of IFMGA guides out there that'll girth hitch through the belay loop versus the tie-in points, and they all have their own opinions on it, but they use them more or less interchangeably. It's not one blanket statement of this to the tie-in points and this to the belay loop. Now, if this video seems like a little bit too much consideration while you're out there, like you just don't have the experience enough to really use extra bandwidth on this topic, then just go with those same blanket statements. You know, if you're just bottom line, girth hitch through the tie-in points, girth hitch through the belay loop, bottom line is you can just go with that blanket idea of only girth hitching through the tie-in points, with the exception of that Petzl Connect Adjust, which is designated by the factory to go through your belay loop. But in the end, if you put it through the tie-in points, it still doesn't really matter. It just doesn't, it's just super blocky. So that's the only issue with that. But there's a lot more nuance to it. And there's a lot of, you know, he said, she said on the matter as well. So I was hoping that maybe this video will get more talking and conversation out there and get people to think about it a little bit more, and also get people to stop commenting on my videos that I'm doing it wrong because I may choose one thing or the other, which is an extra added benefit. So those are the reasons kind of why I do it, and a little bit of clarification around the subject matter. So it's, yeah, again, if it's like you don't want to think about this in the world, just stick with the blanket statements. So thanks for watching, guys. Hope you got something out of this video. I do enjoy making these talking point videos because it's a lot of arguments that I like to, I've been thinking about for 20 years now. So it's nice to get these things out there. I appreciate everything that you guys do for me, and I'll see you in the next video.